Good morning, everyone. Welcome to yet another briefing for yet another UK in a Changing Europe report launch, this time on manufacturing. We've got a fantastic panel. We've got David Bailey from the University of Birmingham, who is the lead author of the report, Mike Hawes from the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, the chief executive, who is here to give his comments on it, Caroline Flint, former MP for Don Valley from 1997 to 2019. Is that right?
Correct.
There we go. And of course, the omnipresent Jill Rutter, who does everything for us all the time now and is delighted about it. Without further ado, we're going to kick off, and I'm going to give the first word to David to introduce the report.
Thank you very much. Now, I'll just try and find out to remind me how to share my slides. Oh, hang on. They're not sharing yet, are they?
No.
Okay, anyway, I'll simply talk through them. So the slides are available, so we can circulate those afterwards. So manufacturing is seen as a small sector of the UK economy, only accounting for formally about 10% of UK output, 9% of total employment, but its significance is much greater than that. It accounts for something like 65% of private research and development spend, 45% of exports, and it pays good wages, on average 15% higher wages than average. And it has many links to other sectors in the economy. So here in the West Midlands, for example, if you take manufacturing and then add to that services linked to it, it's something like a third of the economy. Now, that's not absolutely right, but it's roughly right. And it gives you an idea of the importance of manufacturing in this part of the UK. Manufacturing is also very closely linked with the EU. About half of imports and exports of manufactured goods go to and from the EU. Around 10% of the manufacturing labour force is from other EU countries, and that could be as high as 30% in some sectors like food and drink. There are also very tight supply chain links in some sectors with the EU, particularly automotive, where component parts could cross the channel several times before going into a car sold anywhere in the EU or around the world. So disruption to those links with the EU are likely to have very major effects on manufacturing, and because of manufacturing's importance to the wider economy, the UK economy. There's likely to be some regions that are more likely affected by that disruption to manufacturing. We think of the West Midlands in terms of automotive, the Northwest, for example, and certain sectors which are more particularly exposed, like automotive. And there are three sectors actually that account for 40% of our manufacturing output. That's automotive, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace, all of whom have different concerns around Brexit. So what we did in this report, which has been written with Ivan, my colleague at University of Birmingham, lots of input from our UK and a Changing Europe colleagues, thank you for that, is we've looked at kind of all the evidence we can on the impact of Brexit on UK manufacturing, and we've looked at sort of 10 different areas in which Brexit is likely to have an impact, and I'll very quickly sort of summarise those for you. So tariffs is a big issue. In some sectors like aerospace and pharmaceuticals, even with a no trade deal, tariffs are likely to be low or zero because there are WTO agreements in place. But they're likely to be much higher in others. So for example, with no trade deal, tariffs could be 10% in automotive. Now that could lead to a very significant hit to output in the UK, reducing demand for UK-made cars, and could lead to a shift in production out of the UK to the EU. Now, Mike might say more on that later, but we'd previously estimated the hit from that kind of no trade deal of about 150,000 cars a year, and then more in the long term if investment decisions went away from the UK. Another factor are rules of origin requirements, and this is about proving where the components, the parts come from. This is a major issue in some sectors, again automotive, whereby if there's a trade agreement, you'd probably expect it to be in the range of 55 to 60% local content to qualify for the free trade agreement. Now, given that the supply chains are so closely interlinked in, say, automotive, UK Auto is some way off them. So it would be difficult to meet that. There'd need to be what's called accumulation agreement, where UK and European content is counted together. That's still costly to prove as well. So simply tracing where the parts come from down the supply chain and actually justifying, sort of certifying all that could still add about £5 or £6 billion a year to manufacturing costs. Another factor is non-tariff barriers, including things like customs declarations. That alone would hit manufacturing with about £15 billion a year. And the possible disruption to customs could lead to border delays, which makes just-in-time supply chains much more difficult to manage and possibly mean that companies have to stockpile components, adding to costs. Another issue is regulatory alignment. So here, manufacturers are often concerned that divergence is going to be harmful. Now, okay, the UK government sees regulatory divergence in itself as a benefit of Brexit. That's not the way it's perceived by many manufacturers. And they see that as adding potentially to, in terms of lots of cost to what they do. So if, say, a car maker has to show that it meets regulations in the UK and in the EU, that might mean 2 sets of crash testing, which could add considerably to costs. This is a big issue in aerospace, where the UK so far has been part of the European Aviation Safety Agency, in sectors like medicines, but also in chemicals as well. And there are big issues about how that is going to be resolved longer term beyond the transition period. A whole range of other issues as well, things like geographical indications. This is protection for food and drink, which is one of the UK's biggest manufacturers sectors, where food is made in a certain place. How that is going to work out beyond the transition period there's still a considerable amount of uncertainty there. Issues about data protection and also on state aid. So there may be a bigger sort of potential policy space post-transition for the UK, but if there isn't an agreement over that with the EU, that could in turn disrupt our trading relationship. And it should be noted that before COVID-19, okay, we've seen considerable government intervention of late, but before that, the government wasn't using all of the state aid space that was available to it. Other issues include skills. The new immigration rules should allow firms to fill long-term skill gaps, but there are issues here around short-term needs. So an aerospace manufacturer or a car manufacturer gearing up production at a particular plant, needing to bring in labour from other parts of the EU. And certain sectors like food and drink could be hit by the lack of low-cost labour. Research and development is a potential issue. So considerable EU funding comes in through a number of different means, Horizon 2020, for example, but also the European Investment Bank. UK has said it will replace that European funding in the case of Horizon 2020, but here the issues are around the loss of collaborative opportunities with partners and networks across the EU. And a final point is around uncertainty in investment. So the lack of certainty has really stymied investment in certain sectors. So we've seen a big hit to investment in sectors like automotive in recent years. Overall, Brexit is likely to lead to negative effects on manufacturing. And in fact, manufacturing could be one of the worst hit parts of the UK economy, but the size of the impact and the concerns of industry vary by sector. So in terms of different sectors, automotive, and again, Mike may say more on this, are particularly concerned about the impact of possible tariffs in the event of a no trade deal, about issues around rules of origin, regulatory alignment, and there's a concern that there's a risk of potential major output loss if EU market access is lost and just-in-time supply chains are disrupted. In the case of aerospace, the major concern is about regulatory alignment and about whether the UK aerospace industry, which has been very successful, is able to sell into European and markets worldwide. So far, they're able to do that through membership of ESA. And then across all sectors, there's concern about the lack of certainty about data protection rules and the low level of preparations by manufacturers, many of which haven't mapped their data flows yet. So they don't necessarily know what they need to do post-transit. In terms of sort of post-Brexit opportunities, are there potential positives? Well, maybe. With the sort of extra regulatory space the UK has, it could be quicker in establishing regulatory frameworks in things like, for instance, driverless cars, although we're already very good on that. And even there, access to EU markets and supply chains is still seen as critical by industry. There may be scope to reshore more component suppliers in certain parts of manufacturing to encourage more sourcing of local content. And maybe in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there may be more of an emphasis on supply chain resilience. That's going to need a really dedicated industrial policy to do that. It isn't easy to do. We've done work looking at reshoring and found there are challenges in doing that. But in reviewing the evidence, we found quite few concrete opportunities identified by industry post-transition. Tate and Lyle are hoping, for example, for the elimination of sugar tariffs on cane sugar and quotas. But that's an unusual, a rare example. And we found little or no benefit from regulatory autonomy or divergence identified by industry. Little reason to believe that exiting the EU will boost exports to non-EU markets around the world, and little or any additional attraction for bringing a foreign direct investment into the UK post-Brexit. So just to finish off, we think that post-Brexit we'll really need to consider industrial policy. Government may need to think about short-term measures to support manufacturing. That could involve potentially part-time wage subsidies, loans, tax or rate deferrals. Some of those the government has been doing through the COVID-19 pandemic. We might need to think about extending those and maybe making them more flexible. So there's a more sort of part-time wage subsidy system to allow workers to go into work or then go onto some sort of furlough. Longer term, we think the government could consider a more place-based industrial policy, really to promote UK manufacturing in terms of skills, adoption of Industry 4.0 technologies, adapting to green challenges, rebuilding the supply chain. Remember that manufacturing is going to face multiple challenges, not only dealing with Brexit, recovery from COVID-19, the transition to carbon net zero, and also the uptake of these new technologies that are coming. So, post-pandemic sort of support, I think we can think about supporting certain sectors, taking on new different technologies, and also in doing that, thinking about the whole levelling up agenda. So on that note, Anand, I'll finish off. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You can always count on us for an upbeat start to your day by coming to our briefings. Just a couple of things. Firstly, I'm slightly concerned that John Pete hasn't put his hand up yet. So John, come on, you must have a question by now. If you put your hand up, the way we usually run these things is we let you ask your question, so we can unmute you so you can ask your question rather than getting loads of written ones. I don't know if you can see the questions, panelists, but Peter Foster appears to have written a question in Greek here, as far as I can see. But you might want to have a look at that, Mike, because it's directly addressed to you if you can see it. But I might get Peter to sort of read out his various acronyms himself when we get to questions. But for the moment, over to you, Caroline.
Thanks very much, Anand, and thanks, David and Ivan, for seeking to identify the risks that we've been talking about for a long time, facing all of us after Brexit, but particularly today, manufacturing. And I'm really pleased we're focusing on manufacturing. I think the crucial point out of what you just said, David, is that of all the factors that hamper UK growth and investment, its uncertainty is a far bigger problem than almost any other. However, we all know that COVID-19 has blown away all assumptions about growth after Brexit. A Brexit no deal might have had a 7 to 9% impact on GDP over 15 years if nothing changed. But at a stroke, COVID-19 has wiped that off GDP in just 1 year and probably will lead to a sustained fall in GDP, twice the scale of the banking crash, with unemployment rising sharply to double figures across the EU. Neither sides, I would suggest, in these talks will have much appetite for stifling trade further than necessary. In fact, the EU, as we know, faces massive government debt in the states that are part of it and bailout bills. And already a wide range of EU rules on state aid, free movement, etc. are being temporarily set aside, ignored, or possibly maybe scrapped. So states of left and right are subsidising businesses, and the EU-UK negotiating teams won't be operating in a bubble. So a way through will have to be found that recognises the reality countries are facing to shore up and rebuild their economies within a framework which is effective, but maybe, I would suggest, less prescriptive than it has been. I think your report is right on the central proposition. Manufacturing remains important, not only, as you've said, it because it accounts for 45% of UK exports, but because it also has greater potential to grow than exports like legal services and accounting. And of course, importantly, it's the local supply chains that it creates within communities as well. Now, regardless of Brexit, we should be talking more about manufacturing. 90% of Britons have seen no improvement in living standards since the crash, whilst the top 0.1% of earners have seen their incomes double. The pandemic, as we know, has exposed further weaknesses in the UK economy. We haven't got the capacity to manufacture our own PPE, let alone vaccines. Manufacturing, we know, is twice as important to the economies of Germany, Switzerland, and Singapore. It's really hard to believe that up to a century ago, living standards in the north were higher than in London. So we've got to think about, coming out of this crisis, how we create a way to make our way to a fairer Britain. And it has to be a revival that benefits our regions beyond London and the South East. And I believe manufacturing should be at the heart of that. Now, the choice of a complete trade deal within months or no deal is a false dichotomy. Boris Johnson may well agree what can be agreed, wrap it up in a trade deal, but put on the back burner a whole range of issues that need further work or revisiting. No extension to the transition period, but a substantial rollover of existing provisions nonetheless. On free movement, companies using temporary movements of labour or seasonal workers, I don't think that's the problem. The issue for the UK public is why getting a short-term job in the UK should lead to residency rights down the road. In 2016, 92% of Polish workers in the UK either had or expected to get residency rights. So free movement, in my view, gave too many employers good alternatives to training up a UK workforce when they could import one instead. I would support measures which combined a reasonably generous visa regime with training obligations alongside and impose this sector by sector. The report also quite rightly identifies the complexities and challenges faced by manufacturers in a post-Brexit deal, and you've covered many areas in your opening remarks, David. But the pandemic, a German EU presidency, a healthy UK parliamentary majority, and as we've seen with Northern Ireland, a willingness to show some flexibility bodes well, I think, for a deal by the end of the year. I believe the worst of the threats and challenges are going to be seen off by a mixture of Johnsonian pragmatism and European willingness to show some flexibility and accommodate some variation and divergence. In the end, the gloomsters and doomsters could be proved wrong again. The overwhelming desire for economic growth in a post-COVID world is going to trump everything else, excuse the pun. But whatever the Brexit arrangements, the underlying British challenges remain. We don't train enough, and we don't invest much more than replacing old machinery. We all want new roads, rail and broadband, but every region lags behind the huge sums spent on London's transport network. China, Korea, Singapore all grow faster because they invest in machinery, technology and power. And we've got to do likewise to make more and sell more in a post-Brexit world. And I hope create a fairer Britain in the process.
Thanks ever so much, Caroline. Lots there to chew over, actually. In fact, I'll hold my questions for later on. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. It's helpful when David sort of tees you up so nicely and gives you the context of where automotive fits in. So I'll maybe make my remarks a little briefer because we've covered a lot of it. Yes, as a sector, we are and remain totally integrated in not just a global automotive industry, but a European one as well. About 80% of what we produce is exported, so export-led. Over half of that goes to the rest of Europe. We have, in terms of the supply chain, a dependence on imports. That is not unusual in our sector, given the complexity of the products that we make. Manufacturers look across continents for the best suppliers at the right cost, with the right level of innovation and the right reliability. So the entire European industry sources from within and across Europe. So we have about 1,100 trucks a day coming into the UK to deliver parts and components to the plants. Obviously, the challenges we face as a sector, as David alluded to, are myriad. Trade, and it's not just Brexit, there are increasing global trade tensions, which are having an impact on investment decisions. The UK is caught up in that. Secondly, in terms of the shift in environmental technology, addressing climate change, addressing air quality, these are big, massive investments that automotive companies are having to make, And in doing so, there's a locational decision required, because you have to decide, and you've been producing an internal combustion engine for 120 years. All of a sudden, you're now, comparatively suddenly, moving in towards electrified vehicles. You have to make an investment at a plant to shift that technology. Very capital intensive, incredibly expensive. You may not need the same capabilities, the same number of plants that you had in the past. Other technologies, yes, digitalization, increasing connectivity, autonomous. The way we consider mobility is changing. And it is very interesting. I think we were dashing headlong to these ideas of shared economy, shared ownership, different sectors of a lot of this works on an urban level, but less so on a suburban and a rural area. The COVID crisis has brought some of those issues into sharp relief. Every day we have ministers saying, instead of using public transport, walk, cycle, which is good and we'd fully support, but don't get on public transport. What we've seen is certainly a lot of the plants that we operate would often encourage car sharing. Now that's obviously gone out the window for the time being. How confident will people be in using shared transportation in the future, not just tubes, but car sharing at an urban level? So these sort of dynamics are playing out behind the scenes and are causing the global industry to make some serious decisions over the next 2 or 3 years about what the structure of the industry is going to look like and what the location is going to be. Now, getting back to the heart of the matter, which is Brexit, where does the UK fit into all of that? We have some undoubted advantages in terms of the products that we make tend to be high levels of engineering excellence, have a very flexible workforce. We have some brands that are synonymous with the UK. But what we have, it's quite a diverse industry in that some of the brands, the household names that you know, primarily export to Europe and others export more globally. Think the premiums, Rolls-Royce, Aston Martin, Jaguar, Land Rover, and so forth. So it's not necessarily a consistent impact on all the industry. However, the industry is united in wanting a free trade agreement. It was encouraging what Caroline said about the importance of manufacturing. Perhaps that's come to the fore. Some of us were around in the industry in 2009, 2010. We talked about a rebalancing of the economy and the importance of manufacturing. And I hope to a certain extent we've been able to demonstrate that now, turning our hand from making cars to PPE, ventilators, and so forth. But the clear objective of the industry, and as borne out for all the reasons set out in this report, is about having a free trade agreement. Tariffs would significantly undermine the competitiveness of the industry. 10% is what it is on finished vehicles, 2.5 to 4.5 on components. 10% is 2 to 3 times the margin that most car manufacturing plants operate to. So immediately you're in the red. What I was talking about from the outset about this interrelationship, the majority of cars sold in the UK come from abroad. They balance out. 10% would probably translate through to about £1,500 per vehicle price increase. That'll depress the market in a market which was declining anyway, and COVID is we had a couple of months where the retail was down 90-something%. We're seeing it increase a bit, but it is nowhere near where it needs to be. Some of the other aspects, the tariff is the number one priority. We need to avoid tariffs. We need a free trade agreement which maintains tariff-free and frictionless and quota-free transport. Yes, in terms of rules of origin, that's incredibly difficult even to prove. And one of the things that we're seeking is not just us. Fortunately, when it comes to these negotiations, the European industry, automotive industry, and the UK industry are seeking the same things. We want an ambitious trade deal. We want an approach to rules of origin that gives us time to be able to map this out. It's easy mapping out from OEM to tier 1, but then tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, going up the supply chain and figuring out what the content is. Non-tariff barriers are a concern. We operate just in time, just in sequence. Any delay that would arise, certainly the UK has announced it will have some easements on its side, but the barriers still remain on the other side of the channel. But we need to make sure that there's none of those barriers add further additional costs, because that does undermine competitive. Because I can't stress enough just how important competitiveness is to this industry when the margins are so wafer thin. It's a volume business. So, little layers of cost add up very quickly to make you uncompetitive. The other issue that came out strongly in the report is regulatory alignment. We make to global standards, but by and large, the two major regulatory powerhouses globally are the US and Europe. As you would expect, they don't necessarily always align, and you have to do both. But again, that's adding cost and complexity. What we don't want to see is the UK adding its own regulatory issues on top of it. Finally, and it is a question we often get asked in terms of what are the opportunities? Are there any advantages? It's hard to see any. I think I'm on record as saying Brexit has been about damage limitation. We are constantly looking for opportunities. Trading with other parts of the world, yes, we're already doing that. Can you reduce tariffs onto the US? Hopefully, but they're not the significant barrier. It's more regulatory barriers that they're in the US, and those are the more difficult things to agree in terms of trade agreements. Some of the regulatory framework on autonomous that David mentioned, absolutely, but we have to be seen when talking about autonomous vehicles. It's all about the data. We have to be seen as a safe haven for data, so you can exchange it both ways, and you'll need to do that. So I think in summary, I think the report makes an excellent contribution to that breadth of the issues that we as a sector face, that manufacturing faces. We do hope, we need that free trade agreement. Without it, some of those big decisions that global companies are making will be much harder to make towards the UK, because if your competitive base is undermined and you start to reduce your volumes, then the case for the UK is undermined further.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. I heard Mark Carney yesterday actually talking about a shift from just-in-time to just-in-case supply chains, that apart from anything else struck me as a very good line. Might be something we can come back to, I hope, in the questions. But finally, to round us off, Jill.
Good morning. I'm not going to take very long because you want to bombard the others with very detailed and technical questions. But I thought it was quite interesting. This is the third in a series of reports that UK and Changing Europe's released looking at potential sectoral aspects. A couple of weeks ago, we did services. When we talked about services, the issue was, why is this big sector of the UK economy so under-discussed in the context of Brexit? But if you look at it then, the sort of deal that Theresa May was looking for and the sort of deal that Boris Johnson was looking for, much the same. Not very much discussed, but on both they wanted regulatory autonomy on services and recognised that would mean problems in access and financial services depending on a unilateral EU equivalence decision. Both are more or less in the same place on fish as well. We never really got into where was Theresa May on fish, but both would have been saying the UK is an independent coastal state and we will do a deal with the EU. Perhaps the May government would have been less hardline on that, who knows? But that's a trivial part of the UK economy. The interesting thing about fish is, why is it so important when it's so economically insignificant? I think the really interesting thing about manufacturing is that this is where there is a gulf between the Theresa May ambition and the Boris Johnson ambition. And I think that's to an extent underappreciated, because all of these things go under the rubric of a trade agreement. The May objective, partly for reasons of her solution to Northern Ireland, remember she had a backstop, not the front stop, and therefore needed things that removed the barriers to trade with Northern Ireland, the risk of a hard border. Boris Johnson's accepted that by accepting a different regime for Northern Ireland so that he can go for regulatory autonomy for GB only. But this is where the big difference is. The May, if we were talking last year we'd have been talking about things like the Common Rule Book. The UK would have been seeking to stay in some of those big EU regulatory agencies. I always pronounce it EASA, but I'm going to go with David. ESA, the Air Safety Agency. The May government was potentially going to stay within the EU chemicals regime. The May government wanted to stay in the European Medicines Agency, would have been seeking to negotiate that. That was designed to avoid a lot of the additional hassles that Mike was talking about having to get 2 sets of approvals, one for the UK and the EU, which you have to do if we're outside their regulatory regime, even if we don't actually change the regulations. So there's one thing about staying aligned with the regulation, not having to have manufacturing 2 different standards. The second one is who recognises that you have indeed manufactured to those standards. And I think this is really interesting because we've heard a lot. Jürgen Meyer this week was coming out saying we need a free trade agreement. Manufacturing hasn't got the bandwidth to prepare given COVID, etc. We need to do that. But actually, an awful lot of the preparations you need for the Johnson deal are the preparations you need for no deal as well. The big difference comes in the tariff regime. On the regulatory side, these 2 things could look very different. Obviously, there are facilitations, there are mitigations. We might get mutual recognition of conformity assessment. David's written a bit about that in the report. That's a big hassle if we don't get it. The EU so far is saying no, just because we gave it to Canada doesn't mean we're going to give it to you. So this is potentially a big barrier. So I think it's really interesting that this government is pursuing an ambition of regulatory autonomy, which it thinks will bring big benefits down the line to the UK. The government thus far has been incredibly quiet on, not on the principles, it's very big on the principles, but it's been very quiet on actually where it sees potentially big substantive benefits. Of course, the government would say the existing manufacturing base is all going to want the status quo. They've invested in meeting the standards in the status quo, so of course they want that. We're really talking about future regulation, dynamism, new entrants, not incumbents. So of course those guys would say that. But I think it's really interesting that we haven't had the discussion about where the actual benefits are from regulatory divergence. It's possible that we might go back to something that we floated when I was at Institute for Government a couple of years back, where you actually sign up now and pay a price down the line when you diverge, and the EU takes a bet that actually when you look at the price of divergence, the UK will never actually do that. I'm not sure we would necessarily do that, but a sort of managed divergence is a way of getting out, recognising the price of divergence would be tariffs in the future. So that might be a possible landing zone. We can talk more about that if people are interested. But the one thing that doesn't do is remove what Caroline was saying, which is the spectre of uncertainty from business. So I think we might get a deal on that basis, but then it would be at a longer term cost of, if you have to make a decision when you're looking at where to locate your next plant, the next model, do you do it in the country with guaranteed access to the single market, i.e. everybody else, or do you do it in the UK or actually in GB? And I think some interesting questions are coming on about the status of Northern Ireland in this sort of, what we might call special economic zone as a halfway house between the UK and the single market. So I'm going to stop there and let you pitch into questions.
Thanks, Jill. We've already got some really good questions written. Peter Foster, I hope you're listening because I'm about to press allow to talk. And at that point, it will be great. I love this. This is fantastic power you get as a chair online. You can do everything online, even when we don't have to. But Peter, you are now allowed to talk. So I'm kind of hoping you're going to talk.
Right, I'm here.
Oh, fantastic.
Thank you, everybody. It's all fascinating stuff. A quick question to Mike Hawes, really, which was the extent to which a bilateral deal with the EU on accumulating rules of origin would solve your problems. To my chats in Brussels seem to suggest that that's about the limit of the EU offer. They're certainly not going to go diagonal. And in the absence of a bilateral deal, would PEM membership, which I understand is not, again, raised by the UK, but would PEM membership sort your problems? And then the third leg of that question is, if you get a bilateral deal on accumulation, what does that do to your non-EU sales from UK car plants for, say, cars made in Sunderland and sent to non-EU locations?
Yeah,
Mike and David, I'm going to let you ponder that for a moment because we've got a question from John Pete. I stung into asking a question, I think, and I think this will be for Jill. But John, do you want to ask it out loud if I press this here button?
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Well, thank you, Anand. Thank you for provoking me to ask. But actually, Jill almost touched on my question just at the end. I wonder if she or anybody else thinks that it's plausible that manufacturers might think of moving to Northern Ireland in order to avoid the uncertainty, risks, non-tariff barriers, and so on. I mean, might we see a manufacturing boom in Northern Ireland? And since I'm on, can I just ask Mike Hawes too, what exactly was promised to Nissan in October of 2016? And do you think that promise is still a promise that this government will uphold?
Thank you. I'm going to come to Eric Albert and Andy Pine next, but let's take this round first. Mike, tell us what Nissan got.
Okay, maybe if I try and answer the Greek question first without diving into diagonal accumulation. Yes, it is true in terms of where the two sides are. One of the key issues is going to be issues around rules of origin, and if we get a bilateral deal, this concept of accumulation, which we're going to need. All the options, as I said before, are, to be honest, suboptimal. PEM may be an option, but I don't think it will satisfy all the requirements that we have. As I said before, the European automotive industry, like ourselves, have the same ambitions for the negotiator. Maybe we haven't been successful enough, certainly on the European side, to push that ambition about, especially around rules of origin and what needs to be done. Because the latter part of your question, is absolutely right. What happens to trade elsewhere? Invariably, if whatever we agree with Europe, simultaneously we're trying to do negotiations with Japan, with America, with Australia, New Zealand. You're going to have to basically triangulate those so that they respect that accumulation. If they don't, then basically it's unlikely that we would qualify for those preferential trade agreements, given that the level of local content, originating content, is normally set at a minimum of 55% or something. Second point about Nissan, I think Nissan, to my understanding, were not promised anything significant. When they made the announcement of those three vehicles, yes, there was support with training, with environmental issues and support with the supply chain. That had to go to Brussels for state approval. And let's face it, at the time, Brussels was crawling over any investment decision for any breach of state trade. Yes, there was a letter, and the letter has subsequently been published. And the letter actually says that the UK would seek to maintain the competitiveness of the UK automotive industry, including Nissan, in the forthcoming and future discussions. At the time, the announcement, I think, was, well, I know it was eventually, it sort of leaked out. It wasn't coordinated, and it was portrayed as, we'll maintain the competitiveness of Nissan, and that's a massive difference. If you have that piece of paper, then obviously your ability to raise finance and issues of state aid is very different than if it's just the entire industry. So there was a bit of a misinformation or fake news perhaps around that.
Brilliant, thanks. Jill, do you want to come back on Northern Ireland? You're muted, Jill.
Quite interested to know whether Mike or David have picked anything up. I haven't seen much evidence of moving, but I know that there was a dinner with a German Bundestag member who said that the Germans were worried that some companies might decide to move at least their headquarters to Northern Ireland, particularly to avoid potential retaliatory US tariffs against the EU if they thought that the Trump administration might treat the UK better than the EU. But I haven't seen much evidence. One of the things about Northern Ireland is it doesn't have a terribly strong manufacturing base now. It's predominantly a public sector economy. Obviously, it'd be good to diversify. It's very dependent on EU labour. So the Northern Irish politicians are very worried about the ending of free movement. It's one of the things where the England-Wales sort of attitude seems to be quite different to the Scottish Northern Irish attitudes, where they do feel a need for continued access to to EU labour. So, and that I think is one of the factors which may get some people thinking they need to move out of Northern Ireland into the Republic with more guaranteed access to the single market and potential still abilities to attract EU labour across, though, as Caroline says, we could start addressing that by a much more active skills building programme, which has been a rather big omission. So I've seen no evidence yet, but it may be a possibility depending on how the Northern Ireland regime works out. And depending what happens to sort of living standards in Northern Ireland, we've seen the prospects of potential price riders if the protocol ends up being very onerous and it becomes quite a lot more difficult to supply goods into Northern Ireland from GB, which is of course the major trade route.
David or Caroline, do you want to come in on any of these points?
I would just say that part of the problem, I think, some of the discussion about manufacturing, I understand it because the car industry, Mike, is really important. Airbus is really important. All these things, but what so often happens in these manufacturing discussions is what we don't really talk about. Maybe some of the smaller enterprises that aren't part of a global firm, but actually are really important to our manufacturing base as well. So if I give an example of a firm that builds kitchens here in the UK, in Doncaster, they've taken measures over the last few years that they will invest not just in replacing machinery, but better machinery. That hasn't had the consequence of losing workers. Actually, it's increased the numbers of workers they have and actually improved the pay levels for their workers. And whilst they have employed some Eastern Europeans, actually against the full workforce, they are a tiny part of it. There's a really good example of actually something maybe we should have seen more of before the referendum that might have made a difference. But we need to make sure our manufacturing discussions realise that most firms are not like these global companies. They can't pick and choose around the world where they might want to go, where they get the best deal. They're actually embedded in our communities and we need to help them grow because they independently of their own are manufacturing goods, but they're important to the supply chain as well. And I hope in this debate, actually they get more of a hearing in this too.
Sorry, David, you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Just to follow up on that, I mean, it's a good point that Caroline makes, and that we can kind of regard those small firms as sort of part of the foundational economy, the fabric of our local economies. Bear in mind as well, some of them, though, may be small firms part of much bigger supply chains, which could be impacted. Just on Northern Ireland, I think that's a really interesting point. There is an aerospace industry there, so there may be potential in terms of developing that or even diversifying it. But I think the big issue that Jill touched on is how onerous is that, the sort of the border between the UK, between GB and Northern Ireland going to be in terms of bringing components in. So yes, it's a kind of special economic zone, but there's this border issue with the rest of the GB.
Brilliant. I've got 4 more people. I'm going to take these. If you can all make your questions as brief as possible. We have to finish at 9:30, but I want to squeeze them in. So, Eric, I'm going to unmute you if you're ready.
I'm trying to be ready. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We all talk a lot about worst case scenario and what happened in case of a no deal, but I just want to ask what happened in case of a deal. How badly hit with the current discussion would the manufacturing sector be if there is a deal? And there is a good sign that there might be a deal. If there is a deal, how bad is it still? If there's no tariff, no quota, but no regulatory alignment, no rules of origins or whatever else you mentioned earlier, how badly hit would it be and which sector would suffer most?
Thanks, Eric. Andy Pye, great question, which I think will go to Mike eventually.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I've been in the industry for 40 years, starting as an engineer and then moving into manufacturing journalism. I take in Caroline's points about training. I mean, when I came into the industry, we were still saying exactly the same thing. So I'm fearful that it might take another 40 years before our training scheme is effective, by which time I probably won't care too much about it. And similarly, automation, COVID will probably improve automation, but, our number of robots per 10,000 employees is somewhere between Malta and Thailand, I believe. So we've got a huge way to go on all of these things before we can overcome the European Union benefits. But my question really is, talking to industrialists and leaders of trade associations, reading what people like Make UK and the CBI say in press releases and publicly, they always skirt around the subject. They don't say what in private they say about their members' beliefs, which reflects what David was saying at the beginning, that very few businesses are actually happy about Brexit at all, and particularly about the lack of a transition extension given COVID. And I wondered what the panelists thought about that.
Thanks, Andy. Tom Brown?
Hi, good morning. Thanks for this, very interesting. Just a quick one on the regulatory bodies the UK had been hoping to remain within. It seemed like for a long time that was discussed in very strong terms by Theresa May about the Chemicals Agency and pharma and aerospace. And I just wondered, now it's been abandoned, how dramatic is the impact of that in the short term? It seemed like companies were assuming that some kind of arrangement would be reached, at least for those three sectors, and now that isn't happening. So I was just curious about how much that changed the calculus of the report and the impact on manufacturing in the UK.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, we've got Andrew Alcott.
Good morning.
We can hear you.
Right, good. Yes, mine's
fantastic.
Mine's kind of a side issue regarding reshoring, which of course is much in vogue again now. Or the talk of it is, I should say. The reality may be something different, but we'll see. As far as the auto sector goes, there was some opportunity identified in an SMMT report of some several £billion to reshore components. I think this could have been even 6 years ago, so it wasn't pre the Brexit vote, I guess. But is there still such an opportunity to reshore as there was before? Why did this not happen before? Because it didn't. And what would need to happen to realise a major reshore for automotive, or does the change to e-mobility technology kind of nullify that report, although perhaps present a new opportunity?
Brilliant, thank you, Andrew. There's a lot there. I'm going to add one and go round you all, maybe in reverse order. And my question is, would it have helped manufacturing if transition had been extended? Actually, that's just plagiarism, because that was a question that Tim Bale sent me, so it's not really mine at all. Jill, we've got 10 minutes, so if you can...
Okay, so I talk for 9 minutes and give the other guys 20 seconds each. No, I'm going to leave them to do the main answers. I want to come to this point about the ineffectiveness of industry lobbying. Talk to the service industry, and they think manufacturing was incredibly successful with Theresa May because she moved a very long way towards common rule book and things like that. Though, as we said, partly that was because of Northern Ireland. But they felt a very big difference, and we're asking the question, why did no one listen to us when they listened to people like Mike and his colleagues? So I think, not totally ineffective, but I think if you're a business, and we've talked quite a lot of businesses about this, the government says, well, individual businesses aren't raising issues. It's the trade association. They sort of, and in government, you always slightly discount trade associations, usually a bit lowest common denominator. They would say that, wouldn't they? Things like that's what they're paid for. But we're not hearing it from individual businesses. But if you're a business, I think there is a real reluctance to be seen to be sticking your head above the parapet for two reasons. One is that you will have quite a lot of customers who voted for Brexit, not so much if you're an aerospace company, but if you're making anything which looks like a sort of consumer good, do you want to basically be saying my customers are muppets and got this wrong? Probably not a brilliant tactic. So leave it to the trade association, a bit more anonymous. But the second thing is, particularly now with Boris Johnson's government, you are looking at a government which is potentially in power for quite a long time, will be making a lot of decisions, and you might just fear that actually this government, may not like people. It's not a government that takes well to criticism, I think, however constructive. And you might just think, actually, will I get anywhere? Probably not. Is it worth it? Probably not. and I'll just have to get on with it. So I think it's really interesting. Interesting question for me, going to the question on extension, is do we start to hear industry voices raised? But remember, in a week's time, we've lost the easy extension option in the withdrawal agreement. That's gone. Anything else, we might be able to get an implementation period. Been there, done that before, into a deal if we do one, but probably not until very late in the day. Does that really help business? Things like that. So I think, you have to look at the incentives on individual businesses to try and take on the government potentially unsuccessfully.
Cheers, Jill. Mike, can I come to you now?
Yeah, sure. I would generally agree in terms of the impact of trade associations vis-a-vis business. Business does find it difficult to put its head above the parapet on political issues, and especially as an automotive, when they're often foreign owned, it's perceived as getting involved in a domestic political issue. They've had to overcome that reticence, and a lot of our members have been crucified over the last 4 years for doing so. But certainly, the role of a trade association is to try and ensure the survival of that sector. So we just have to do that. Eric's question about what would the deal look like? What would be the effect of the deal? I'm afraid the answer is probably, in the question, it depends what the deal is. If we can avoid tariffs, that's the number one priority. There are other implications, and I think by definition, if you're going to arrive at something which allows you to avoid tariffs, you by definition are going to have to get an agreement on rules of origin, because of the concerns about there being a backdoor to other imports of goods. On Tom's question on the regulatory bodies, we don't actually have one in automotive. It's basically it's a member state competence. So the member states can issue the necessary approvals that allows us to put a product on the market and sell it anywhere within the single market. We lose that ability. We have the ability, but we don't have the regulatory approval authorization to do that. So UK manufacturers therefore have to go to Sweden, Germany, France, wherever else to get that approval. And we'll see what happens for the requirements. Just going back to what Jill says earlier about whether we're going to need a UK approval, because the chances are we will, to put the vehicle on the road in the UK, the same vehicle on the road in Europe. Reshoring, that's an interesting one at the moment. There's a lot of talk about COVID concentrating people's minds about the importance of resilience. I'm less convinced of that. I still think given what I said at the very outset about when you are operating on a volume basis, very thin margins, what matters is cost, quality, innovation, and reliability on supply. So that last point, there's an overlap there with resilience. You're right, Andrew, there was the report the Automotive Council put out looking at the opportunity, and those opportunities still there. We don't make probably 20-30% of the products that go into vehicles. We just don't have that industry. Famously, we make very, very few alloy wheels, yet you can make 1.5 million vehicles. There's at least 4 of them on every vehicle. That's an opportunity. But to attract people here, what we have seen is a consistent erosion of investment in automotive over the last 3 years. Last year, there was a bit of a spike because of one particular Jaguar Land Rover investment. That investment has gone down because people are still sitting on their hands, waiting to see, are the OEMs, are the major manufacturers going to be there for the long term? If they are, you can consider that investment. The other point, and it goes back to what Caroline was alluding to about people. If I was to invest in the UK, is the talent there? Are the people there? Will I be able to recruit? We know we have a skill shortage in the UK in automotive that can dissuade people as well. And finally, extension. Well, extension is not going to happen. Yes, the industry wants clarity, but above all, it wants clarity of the right direction, and that depends very much on the deal.
Thank you. Caroline?
I'm sure there are a huge number of firms that are generally resistant to Brexit, but I would also suggest that most have far bigger worries arising from the COVID pandemic about whether they're actually going to survive to the end of the year. And therefore, everything has been turned on its head to a certain extent about how we come out of this pandemic. I also think that for business, I'm afraid to say, I think the likes of the CBI did not have a pragmatic approach to accepting Brexit, and as a result, their voice was ineffective. Having gone through the last few years as a Member of Parliament, I think part of the problem was that CBI and other organisations got caught up in the sort of, if you like, say no to no deal, which for some people and some agents, both in business and outside of it, was really a vehicle to stop Brexit. And that was how it was perceived by the public, large sections of the public, and also I have to say by people who did want to stop Brexit. They thought that was a good campaign. But what it meant also was that whilst the industries like Mike's and the CBI might have had an influence on Theresa May in terms of trying to get a deal that covered many of the points we've discussed this morning, what they didn't do was actually persuade MPs to back Theresa May's deal. And by not doing so, they shot themselves in the foot. She went. Boris Johnson inevitably became the Conservative leader. They might as well not have had a contest. And then, surprise, surprise, on top of all that, he went and got a deal. And that threw a cat amongst the pigeons. And then we ended up with an election. So I think, you know, when people can sort of now move on, they have to remember the failure of that lobbying over the last few years. And going forward, may I suggest that if you get stuck in that groove again around just focusing on no deal, I mean, I don't think we should leave without a deal, but you need to focus, I think, on the elements that have been discussed in David's report and see what you can get out of that. And I think a deal's there to be done. But I think also, Mike, that actually about training and about skills, we need to hear more from industry about how we're going to solve that problem. For 22 years as an MP, I've had every lobbying group, trade association come to me about this. They've been on all sorts of task force under Labour and Conservative governments. A huge amount of money has gone into this, but the end result has still not produced what we want. So we need to fundamentally address some of those issues rather than constantly complaining about it. And on your question, Anand, about a longer extension, is that to be preferred? I think the problem is that also delays the inevitable. I still feel that a deal will be struck. I think there might be more existing arrangements that carry over than people might think, but also getting a deal which leaves us some areas, which again I know causes uncertainty, but at least it's not a cliff edge for other matters to be resolved over the longer term. But fundamentally, nobody can back away from some of the problems whilst we've been in the EU about our manufacturing base and having more diversity and more growth in that sector. And let's hear a bit more about what we should have been doing about that and how we're going to solve that in the future, because I think that's where we need to have some positive engagement.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. David, the last word is yours.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, Eric, because of my technological incompetence, I didn't have my slides up, but in figure 7 in the report, there's sort of listing of different manufacturing sectors and how they're impacting on whether there's a trade deal or no trade deal and restrictions on labour. So that have a look at that. That should answer your question. In terms of extension, it isn't going to happen. But picking up on what Caroline was just saying, I think where there may be scope is beyond the transition period, some sort of cooperative arrangement around the regulatory bodies. Can we know that falling out of the regulatory bodies in pharmaceuticals, aerospace, in medicines is going to be extremely damaging for those industries. Can some sort of cooperative system be set up to allow an adjustment? So a kind of post-transition transition on regulation, as it were. On reshoring, we found before the referendum, going back to sort of 2016, about 1 in 6 manufacturers doing it. But there are big barriers to doing reshoring and bringing back sourcing of components or making stuff to the UK. Things like energy costs, skills, access to finance, even land. So if you really want to push that, you need much more of an industrial policy. And that's a point to finish on from my point of view, which also links with what Caroline was saying in terms of skills. I think we need much more of a kind of devolved industrial policy to a regional level. A lot of the regional level was kind of taken away with the abolition of the regional development agencies. I think we need to think about whether we've got to put something back in place to do industrial policy at a regional scale on things like skills, rebuilding our supply chains, on adapting to Industry 4.0 technology. So that, that might be something that we can agree on in terms of going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Thank you particularly to Caroline and Mike for agreeing to do this with us. Thank you all for attending. We will send out the slides to everyone. And I know there's a few of you who haven't had your questions answered. What I would say is if you want to email your questions back, I'll ping them all over to David and dump it all on him and he can reply to you individually. That would be great. No, but seriously, I'm happy to put you in touch with any of our team who can answer your questions. So do reply to the slides with any more questions you have, and that's absolutely fine. And keep well, everyone. The big news from today is I've booked a restaurant table for the 4th of July, so I'm more hopeful than ever now that we'll be able to do this in person at some point, hopefully even this year. But take care of yourselves and we'll see you all, or not see you all, soon. Particular thanks to the panelists. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.